Let me begin by thanking the Nation Group for bringing all of us together today, especially the business leaders who have been championing this cause of climate and nature, right? You've heard a lot about climate action, carbon neutrality, GHGs, decarbonization, and even a little about SDGs. I'm not going to speak to any of these. I'm going to speak to the theme of nature and biodiversity. And I'm not going to start with what the UN does. I'm going to start with what I believe the government, the private sector, and the financial markets need to do more of to address this theme of nature and biodiversity. And I'm then going to come to the UN. And I want to begin by commending the business leaders for championing climate action, but it is now that we need to devote the same attention to nature and biodiversity. Our efforts need to be directed not only towards net zero emission targets, but also towards no net loss in biological diversity of genetics, species, and ecosystems. This means that our impact on biodiversity will need to be offset or neutralized or minimized. In fact, the aim should be to put back more into nature than we take from nature, as land and oceans absorb nearly half of the total GHGs that are emitted. The Bangkok goals that were recently adopted at the APEC summit provide us with a new impetus to take this theme forward regionally. We can capitalize on this momentum and ambition by scaling up nature-based solutions in line with the just concluded COP27 on climate action and the upcoming COP15 on biodiversity. These two global summits coming in quick succession is no coincidence. Their timing signifies that climate action and biological diversity are intrinsically linked and require concerted approaches. Let me also mention that as we speak, representatives of government, business, and other stakeholders are meeting to forge the first steps towards a legally binding agreement on plastics, which is led by the UN Environment Assembly. Thailand has the policies and will soon have a pretty robust legislative framework to better conserve, protect, and restore biodiversity. The government can leverage these to accelerate progress in partnership with the private sector. During my consultations with business leaders, they've made 3 actionable recommendations. And this links somewhat to what Dr. Harold you raised as one. One is a consistent whole-of-government approach can streamline enabling mechanisms and improve pathways for collaboration. 2, the government can prioritize geography-based approaches in protecting habitats that can incentivize reforestation, as you mentioned, on private lands and a community-centered protection of biodiversity hotspots. 3, the private sector's engagement with local communities can help government in raising awareness on environmental issues, boosting capacity, and creating nature-based income generation opportunities. Members of the Global Compact Network in Thailand have already taken a lead on climate by committing to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. As of last year, the GCNT reduced the carbon emissions by roughly 8 million tons, which amounts to 2% of Thailand's GHGs. Just as the private sector is championing climate action, it can also lead as champions of nature. As Khun Supachai mentioned earlier this afternoon, in a precedent setting global first. GCNT members have recently committed to helping protect 30% of land and marine areas nationwide in alignment with COP15. Many of the prominent business leaders that were present here today stress that biodiversity protection must lie at the heart of business decisions and are adopting nature-based practices accordingly. This commitment is highly encouraging. However, to achieve positive changes, we need to set nature-based targets under the leadership of the government. Similarly, and this is my third point, domestic financing will be extremely critical to unlock additional resources to support no net loss in biodiversity alongside carbon neutrality. Nature-related financing risks are increasingly affecting bottom lines, as it is not something that can be wished away. Yet, according to a recent survey of the signatories of the UN Principles of Responsible Banking, only 15% of banks identified biodiversity as an impact area. To stay ahead of this curve, bankers, investors, and asset managers in Thailand will need to take a central role in green financing, setting a minimum threshold for green lending and investment, which we understand some banks and investors have already created for their own internal business operations, will enable us to fast-track this transformation. Our analysis suggests that an initial threshold of just over 6% for green lending and investment could enable this country to meet its green infrastructure requirements and contribute to transformative environmental outcomes. At the same time, nature-related financial disclosures need to be integrated into the ESG framework and reflected in the one report, as investments in nature will continue to pay dividends for generations. What is our strategy at the UN? Our strategy at the UN focuses on bringing stakeholders together to raise understanding and ambition to invest in biodiversity. We've been working with government and the private sector to introduce and scale up sustainable practices and promote the creative economy in line with the BCG model. UNEP is assisting the government with sustainable rice production to enhance biodiversity in the paddy fields while maintaining yields, mitigating environmental impacts, and reducing GHGs. Analysis suggests that boosting organic rice production by as less as 10% in the country could result in returns of over $400 million in 15 years. In another initiative led by UNESCO and supported by Expedia, more than 500 large and medium hotels nationwide have signed the Sustainable Travel Pledge. They plan to soon eliminate single-use plastics and promote sustainable local products at tourist destinations as part of the creative economy. Our transformative partnerships also extend to local communities around biodiversity hotspots for sustainable management of ecosystems. These communities have been prioritizing ecologically responsible practices with the UN lending nationwide support. For instance, UNDP has provided technical expertise to local communities to protect 3 endangered species: the eastern Sarus crane, the spoon-billed sandpiper, and water lily. One of these undertakings between conservationists, officials, and local people protect wetlands in organically cultivated rice in Buriram province, where farmers are compensated for hosting reintroduced Sarus cranes in their fields. This is an example of the symbiotic coexistence between people and wildlife, which has enabled the eastern Saras cranes to be brought back into the wild here in Thailand. Equally important are closer partnerships with enterprising individuals, especially youths who are nature champions. Many young people are devoting their time, their energy, and their money to preserve and conserve hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, protecting habitats and saving endangered species. In doing so, they are providing citizen-driven models for biodiversity protection, which will be key in the future to complement government and private sector efforts. For instance, young Akha people in the mountainous parts of northern Thailand have led a grassroots initiative to preserve local plant species and sustain ethnic agricultural practices. In closing, I would like to stress that the value of healthy ecosystems goes much beyond economic price tags we place on them. The goal of no net biodiversity loss is a multi-generational challenge. Its success is going to require a whole of society approach that recognizes the importance of nature and builds the capacity to protect it. Through the collective action of government, private sector, civil society, and individuals, we can protect habitats and preserve nature for generations to come and for our own well-being. So thank you very much, and Khap Kun Kha.